Flight attendant shames overweight woman, unaware she's influential Congresswoman. Welcome to today's riveting tale. Prepare yourselves for a journey filled with shocking twists, heart-racing tension, and a powerful message about the dangers of judging others too quickly. At the center of our story stands a hard-working Congresswoman, quietly battling personal challenges, yet determined to protect the rights of everyday citizens. When she boards a routine flight, no one could predict the turbulence that would unfold both inside and outside the cabin. Stay tuned for petty rivalries, startling revelations, and jaw-dropping surprises. You won't want to miss a single moment of this extraordinary narrative of power, prejudice, and triumph. Before we dive in, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. If you're excited about this story, let us know. If you enjoyed the video, press 1. If not, press O. Your feedback really inspires me to gather more uplifting and meaningful stories. The late afternoon sun bathed the tarmac in gold as passengers hurried through the bustling Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, each person driven by private ambitions and urgent schedules. Among them was Congresswoman Harriet Lockwood, dressed in an understated navy blazer that did little to display her status. She clutched a brown leather tote containing meticulously organized legislative drafts bills. She had fought so hard to push onto the House floor. Harriet was exhausted but resolute. She had just finished back-to-back meetings in Atlanta on healthcare reform and was eager to return to Washington, D.C. for more discussions. Despite the subtle pang of anxiety she always felt when flying, she whispered a reminder to stay calm. Little did she know that in a matter of minutes, a series of unexpected confrontations and revelations would shake her composure in ways she never thought possible. As she stepped onto the jet bridge leading to the Delta Airlines aircraft, the constant hum of rolling luggage and overhead announcements about delayed flights felt oddly oppressive. Travelers jostled in line, cutting glances at one another, tired, stressed, and eager to settle in for the trip. Harriet inhaled slowly, hoping the flight would be uneventful. She was scheduled for a pivotal committee meeting in Washington the following morning, and the success of a new healthcare initiative hinged on her timely arrival. Yet in the swirl of voices and the crush of bodies vying for overhead space, no one guessed that this calm, overweight woman, struggling with her carry-on, was the central figure who might soon change airline policies nationwide. From the moment Harriet boarded, she was greeted by an icy gaze from a flight attendant named Charlotte. Charlotte had worked for Delta Airlines for a decade. During that time, she'd grown cynical. The job demanded constant patience with passengers who expected the world but offered little respect in return. Charlotte's mental exhaustion had gradually morphed into outright contempt for certain travelers, especially those who, in her opinion, took up too much space. Harriet noticed Charlotte eyeing her with a scrutinizing look that pierced more than Harriet cared to admit. She tried to dismiss the feeling and politely smiled. However, as Harriet navigated the narrow aisle, Charlotte's demeanor grew colder. She watched Harriet's labored steps and disapprovingly shook her head. On the surface, Harriet appeared to be just another passenger struggling to fit through cramped rows and overhead bins. Nonetheless, Harriet bore an extraordinary burden of legislative power on her shoulders, a detail Charlotte neither knew nor cared to discover. Harriet trudged slowly to her seat, bracing herself for what she hoped would be a quiet flight. But some niggling sensation in her gut warned her otherwise. The tension wafting from Charlotte's disdainful stare seemed to herald drama that was anything but ordinary. Moments after Harriet settled in seat 14B near the window, she realized she had misjudged the seat's narrowness. Her arms felt pinned by the immovable boundaries of the armrests. Though uncomfortably aware of her weight, Harriet rarely allowed such discomfort to break her strong will. She had faced bigger challenges on the floor of the House debates that hammered her integrity, legislation that tested her resolve. A too-tight seat was a minor inconvenience by comparison. Yet, the physical constriction made her senses sharpen, as if preparing her for battle. Before the plane could even begin taxiing, Charlotte appeared in the aisle, scanning seats. Spotting Harriet's pinned shoulders, the flight attendant abruptly halted. She cleared her throat loudly, enough for a few nearby passengers to turn. "Ma'am," Charlotte said in an exasperated tone, "are you sure you fit comfortably there? Perhaps you should have purchased an extra seat, or upgraded to first class if you need more space." The words, laced with scorn, carried far across the hush of the cabin. A few gasps arose from other travelers. Harriet's cheeks burned, but she swallowed her anger. She kept her voice calm and low, but it trembled with tension. "I'm fine, thank you," Harriet managed, focusing on controlling her breathing. She silently vowed not to let Charlotte rattle her, but the seeds of a deeper conflict had been sown. After Charlotte's unwarranted remark, other passengers pretended to look away or became overly focused on their phones. Harriet, wanting to preserve a sense of dignity, turned toward the window and tried to calm her rattled nerves. She silently reminded herself that not every confrontation deserved an immediate response. She had wrestled with bullies in the political arena, and she could endure this minor humiliation. But a sense of unease persisted. The look of open disdain on Charlotte's face was haunting, as if Harriet's very presence was an affront. Soon, announcements began. The pilot introduced herself as Captain Regina Myers, a seasoned professional known for her quick thinking and calm demeanor. Harriet allowed the soothing, measured tone of the pilot to calm her nerves. She also spotted a second flight attendant, Mateo, discreetly observing Charlotte's chilly behavior. Though Harriet didn't know it, Mateo had grown disillusioned with Charlotte's frequent sarcasm and rude remarks. Over the past few weeks, he'd witnessed her haughty treatment of overweight, elderly, or differently abled passengers. Yet, Harriet had no inkling that behind the scenes, a quiet ally was already troubled by Charlotte's attitude and ready to step in if things went too far. Once the plane took off, the seatbelt sign blinked off, allowing passengers to stretch their cramped legs. Harriet, pinned into her seat, simply reached for a magazine. She found it difficult to concentrate, partly because the cabin had become a tight web of suspicious stares and hushed conversations. She sensed that Charlotte might say or do something else humiliating. As if on cue, Charlotte re-emerged with the beverage cart, distributing drinks and small pretzels. Her expression, locked into a plastic smile, wavered into disdain when she came to Harriet's row. Harriet requested water and ginger ale, hoping the combination might ease her simmering nervousness. Charlotte placed the plastic cups before her, then loudly said, "You might want to reconsider the snacks, dear. Too many calories." Heads turned, and Harriet felt her heart rate spike. Before Harriet could respond, Charlotte turned on her heel and moved on, tossing Harriet a final, disdainful glance. Mateo, who had been serving the row behind Harriet, swallowed hard. He had witnessed Charlotte's outburst and was appalled, yet he didn't want to cause a scene at 35,000 feet. He mentally noted the encounter, one more piece of evidence that Charlotte was spiraling toward a confrontation that could jeopardize the flight's entire atmosphere. The first strong pockets of turbulence hit, forcing the entire cabin to jolt violently. Gasps filled the air, and the flight deck's intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Myers. We're experiencing some rough air ahead, so please fasten your seatbelts." Passengers scrambled to comply. Harriet's hands gripped the armrests, but her mind was still stuck on Charlotte's humiliating remark. She tried to focus on the pilot's calm instructions. Next to Harriet sat a mild-mannered college professor named Gerald, who was traveling to Washington, D.C. for an academic conference. He looked at Harriet kindly. "That was uncalled for," he whispered. Harriet forced a small smile. She hardly knew Gerald, but his sympathetic gaze offered a sliver of comfort. She thought of replying, but the plane gave another shudder, drowning any conversation in a collective cry of alarm. Determined to maintain a sense of decorum, Harriet turned to the professor and nodded. Although Harriet was used to speaking up for others, veterans, senior citizens, communities in need, she felt an irrational hesitation. Surely, a public meltdown at 35,000 feet wasn't the best approach. Nonetheless, Harriet could feel the simmering tension inside her chest, the desire to stand up for herself and all overweight people who endure daily jabs like Charlotte's. Despite the turbulence, Charlotte strode down the aisle, seemingly unbothered by the plane's rattling. Harriet noticed that Charlotte was fixated on another passenger who was having difficulty stowing away a large carry-on. As Charlotte scolded that passenger, Harriet realized the flight attendant's scorn didn't solely target her. Charlotte was an equal opportunity offender when it came to travelers who inconvenienced her sense of order. Harriet's grip tightened on her seatbelt. The plane shook once more, stronger this time. Overhead bins rattled. A few overhead compartments popped open. Suddenly, a piercing scream erupted from the back row. An elderly passenger had lost her balance during the turbulence and slid into the aisle. Alarmed, Harriet craned her neck to see what was happening, while Charlotte initially seemed hesitant to rush to the woman's aid. Instead, Charlotte barked at people to remain seated, insisting that it was for everyone's safety. Yet, it was evident the older lady needed immediate help getting back to her seat. Harriet, ignoring her own fear, unbuckled her belt just as the plane stabilized for a moment. She slid out into the aisle, feeling the eyes of the entire cabin on her. Harriet carefully helped the woman stand, guiding her safely to her seat, all under Charlotte's stone-cold gaze. Several startled passengers witnessed Harriet's quick thinking. Some thanked her in hushed tones. In that instant, Harriet's natural leadership shone through. She was used to diffusing crises, albeit typically in the domain of heated congressional debates rather than a swaying plane. As Harriet returned to her own seat, Charlotte approached, arms folded across her uniform jacket. "Are you some kind of hero now?" she asked sarcastically, her voice low enough to avoid attracting the attention of the other flight attendants. Harriet, deciding she'd had enough, responded calmly, "I believe it's part of our responsibility as humans to help each other, don't you?" Her measured tone stung Charlotte more than any heated retort could have. Sensing a power in Harriet's words she couldn't identify, Charlotte pursed her lips and said nothing. When Harriet finally sat down, she realized that small exchange had heightened the tension to an almost unbearable level. The entire cabin's atmosphere felt charged, like the dense air before a thunderstorm. Harriet looked around and noted that people were watching closely. While Harriet still kept her identity under wraps, the flicker of quiet authority in her eyes did not go unnoticed by many who were near enough to hear the exchange. Harriet soon discovered a bizarre complication. The overhead bin above her seat had been jammed shut during the turbulence, and no one could seem to open it. Several passengers had tried and failed, worried that the latch might have become permanently stuck. Harriet's laptop, containing crucial documents about her proposed healthcare bill, was inside. Without those documents, Harriet's upcoming committee meeting could be jeopardized. The stress only multiplied. Then, out of nowhere, Charlotte reappeared and gave the bin a few hard slaps. Without warning or explanation, the latch snapped open, sending Harriet's laptop bag tumbling. Harriet lurched forward just in time to prevent the laptop from smashing onto the floor. Charlotte merely shrugged. "Try not to stuff your things too tightly next time, okay?" she said, her tone scornful. Harriet, her nerves fraying, swallowed her frustration once more. She realized that losing her temper with a disgruntled flight attendant at that altitude would solve nothing. Still, Harriet's thoughts churned. If only Charlotte knew who she was speaking to and the influence Harriet wielded on Capitol Hill. The same woman Charlotte treated with open contempt had the power to advocate for or against legislation that could drastically affect airline operations, including workers' rights and passenger regulations. Yet Harriet remained steadfast in her resolve not to escalate the conflict, at least not yet. As the flight continued, a strange rumor began to spread among the passengers. Someone whispered about a potential security threat on board. Harriet initially dismissed this as anxiety from the earlier turbulence, but she noticed how quickly the chatter spread. Snippets of conversation reached her ears, something about an unnamed passenger acting suspiciously. Passengers who had previously been dozing off suddenly sat upright, scanning the cabin. The rumor eventually reached Harriet's row. Gerald leaned in and murmured, "They say someone found a cryptic note in the restroom." Harriet felt a jolt. She had been part of legislative committees focusing on transportation security. The idea that a real threat might exist mid-flight was terrifying. Was it a false alarm or something more insidious? The lights flickered momentarily due to another bout of rough air, amplifying everyone's anxiety. Harriet's heart thumped. She looked around, searching for clues. Meanwhile, Charlotte busied herself, moving up and down the aisle, looking more irritated than alarmed. Harriet wondered if the rumor was credible or if it was just another random incident fueling the tension on this flight from Atlanta to D.C. Amid the swirling rumors, Harriet noticed Charlotte approach with a determined expression, zeroing in on a young man near the emergency exit row. He wore headphones, a hooded sweater, and had been writing in a small notebook. Harriet couldn't make out any details. But Charlotte's demeanor was unmistakable. She had latched onto him as the supposed threat. "Sir," Charlotte snapped, "I'll need to see what you're writing." The entire row looked stunned. The young man blinked in confusion, pulling off his headphones. When he resisted handing over the notebook, Charlotte's voice escalated. She insinuated that the cryptic note might belong to him, further stoking the cabin's tension. Harriet's unease flared. She'd seen how fear could be manipulated to justify discriminatory behavior. Knowing better than to intervene without evidence, Harriet watched carefully. The young man, flustered but cooperative, eventually flipped through his pages to show Charlotte. It was only a list of rap lyrics he was composing. Realizing her mistake, Charlotte stared at him in shock, but rather than apologize, she snapped the notebook shut and walked away. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, unsettled by Charlotte's readiness to accuse someone on tenuous grounds. Harriet sensed a dangerous pattern in Charlotte's actions. As the flight progressed, Harriet's resolve hardened. There would be consequences for such reckless and demeaning behavior. The plane's turbulence had momentarily calmed, but the emotional turbulence on board was at a boiling point. Harriet looked out the window to see the roiling white of thick clouds rising like walls in the sky. She remembered a piece of advice her mentor in Congress, Representative Florence Walker, had once offered: never mistake silence for absence of strength. Sometimes the quiet ones hold the greatest power. Harriet let these words resonate through her. She felt a storm of her own building inside, but she bided her time, letting events unfold until the moment demanded her leadership. At that instant, an announcement came from Captain Myers. "Folks, we're about to enter a line of severe storms. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Harriet braced herself. She sensed how metaphorically apt it was. Turbulence outside, turmoil within. Over the next half hour, the jet roared through waves of buffeting wind. Suddenly, a bright flash streaked past the right-wing lightning. Gasps filled the cabin, and Harriet realized some passengers were on the edge of panic. She thought she saw Charlotte hurrying to the front, eyes widening with fear. Even though Harriet had no official authority here, her instincts as a leader told her she might be called upon to calm frightened souls. The tension in the cabin was about to erupt in unexpected ways. With the plane caught in the heart of the storm, Harriet felt her seat shake violently. Then came a new jolt of panic, a commotion 2 rows ahead. A passenger, a middle-aged man in a business suit, had slumped forward. His seatmate frantically tried to rouse him. Calls for a doctor rippled through the cabin. Harriet unbuckled, fighting the plane's rocking to see if she could help. Her background was in law and policy, not medicine, but she had once taken a first aid course for staffers on Capitol Hill. She could at least assess basic signs or help retrieve medical supplies. By the time Harriet made it over, Mateo had arrived with the emergency medical kit. Charlotte hovered uncertainly on the fringes. Harriet noted with alarm that the passenger wasn't responding, though he appeared to be breathing. With trembling hands, Harriet helped retrieve a portable oxygen device, while another passenger, who happened to be a nurse, tried to check the man's pulse. This crisis overshadowed the earlier tension, momentarily uniting everyone in concern for the man's life. Charlotte offered minimal assistance, so Harriet took charge, guiding the nurse and Mateo as they carefully positioned the man. The plane lurched again. The overhead lights flickered, and Harriet prayed fervently that they would come through this storm soon enough to make an emergency landing if needed. As the situation with the unresponsive passenger stabilized, he was breathing more regularly. With supplemental oxygen, Harriet felt an acute sense of relief. Yet a cold voice shattered that fragile calm. "Monsieur A.M.," Charlotte said, "you really shouldn't be in the aisle. You're blocking traffic and endangering safety protocols." Harriet, incredulous, stared at her. "I was assisting a medical emergency," she replied, struggling to contain her anger. She could see the nurse's astonished expression, as if she too couldn't believe Charlotte's insensitivity. But Charlotte merely doubled down, pointing an accusatory finger. "You might have training for your whatever job you do," she said, gesturing vaguely at Harriet's blazer and ID badge, which Harriet had turned around to keep her identity discreet. "But you are endangering other passengers by crowding the aisle. Maybe you should focus on losing some weight instead of playing nurse." A collective gasp spread, a wave of shocked indignation that no one had expected to reach such a boiling point. Harriet stood there, stung, her composure finally starting to crack. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the pilot's voice echoed through the cabin. "We're diverting to Charlotte Douglas International Airport due to severe weather and a medical emergency. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." The tension soared, overshadowed by the precarious descent they faced through the storm. Harriet locked eyes with Charlotte, silently vowing that her cruelty would not go unanswered. The landing was one of the roughest Harriet had ever experienced. The plane pitched and rolled, drawing shrieks from anxious passengers as the wheels screeched against the wet runway. Finally, the aircraft came to a halt at a remote gate where paramedics rushed on to tend to the ailing passenger. Rain pounded against the fuselage, thunder rattled the overhead compartments, and everyone remained seated, dazed by the sudden diversion. Harriet felt beads of sweat forming on her forehead. When the paramedics cleared the man for further evaluation at the hospital, the captain announced a layover in Charlotte for at least an hour, pending weather updates. Passengers murmured among themselves about missed connections and the fiasco of rebooking. Meanwhile, Harriet's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from her aides, anxious about her whereabouts. She typed out messages explaining the delay, but left out the humiliating encounter with Charlotte. Harriet's mind was torn between her pressing responsibilities in D.C. and the mounting sense that she needed to stand up not just for herself, but for all who'd been mistreated by the abrasive flight attendant. During the unscheduled layover, the door to the aircraft was opened briefly to allow the paramedics to wheel out the ill passenger and to bring fresh supplies aboard. Harried gate agents also boarded, hustling to answer passenger questions and manage the chaos. Harriet took the opportunity to speak privately with Matteo. With the cabin mostly empty, many passengers had rushed to the terminal to stretch their legs or find an alternative flight. Harriet felt a burst of determination. "Your colleague has been incredibly rude," Harriet stated quietly, "not just to me but to others. This can't be acceptable airline policy." Matteo sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Look, I've tried to talk to her, but Charlotte's been difficult. She thinks some passengers don't deserve courtesy if they inconvenience her, and I think she's jealous of any perceived power or authority. It's not right." He glanced at Harriet's ID badge. "Who are you anyway? You don't seem like just a random passenger." Harriet exhaled. She flipped her ID badge around discreetly, showing the seal of the United States House of Representatives. Matteo's eyes widened. "Congresswoman Harriet Lockwood?" he whispered in awe. "Oh my gosh, I've seen you on the news, advocating for healthcare expansion and new airline regulations. If Charlotte knew who you were." Harriet placed a hand on Matteo's arm to calm him. "She doesn't know, and I don't want special treatment, but I won't tolerate harassment and discrimination on my flight or any flight." As boarding resumed for the second leg of the journey now from Charlotte Douglas International Airport to Washington, D.C., a new layer of tension filled the cabin. Word had spread among some passengers that Harriet was no ordinary traveler. Whispers traveled quickly, and curious eyes were drawn to Harriet's seat. Unaware of Harriet's full identity, Charlotte picked up where she left off, practically rolling her eyes whenever Harriet asked for anything, even a simple glass of water. An hour into the flight, as the plane soared above the receding storm systems, Harriet felt the time had come. She pressed the attendant call button. Charlotte arrived, an impatient scowl on her face. "Yes?" she asked bluntly. Harriet measured her words. "I'd like to address something with you. Your repeated comments about my weight and your tone toward other passengers. It is unacceptable. If you're unaware, I'm Congresswoman Harriet Lockwood, and I was just in Atlanta discussing legislation that includes airline consumer protection. The way you've behaved towards me and others on this flight is extremely troubling." The color drained from Charlotte's face. She stammered, "But you never said." "I didn't realize. It shouldn't matter who I am," Harriet said firmly, her voice carrying the controlled authority she often used in hearings. "No one deserves your disrespect. I've seen you publicly humiliate people, accuse them without basis, and ignore your duty to assist. You should know that airline customer service is under scrutiny on Capitol Hill, and your behavior, it's a prime example of why stricter regulations and oversight might be necessary." Other passengers nearby overheard. A hush fell over them, and they leaned in, enthralled by this moment of accountability. Charlotte gulped, her bravado crumbling under Harriet's steady gaze. For a moment Charlotte struggled for words, but Harriet continued, "I have the power to set hearings on issues exactly like this. I've kept quiet about your unprofessional conduct until now, but I won't stay silent anymore. People of all sizes, backgrounds and abilities deserve respect. If you find your job so burdensome that you can't offer courtesy, maybe it's time for you to reevaluate your position." At those words, the entire row sat in reverent silence. Gerald, the professor, was wide-eyed. The young man with the notebook looked vindicated, as if the moment had finally come to set things right. Charlotte's lips quivered. Her haughtiness had evaporated, replaced by fear and regret. She mumbled a soft apology first to Harriet, then to the young man she'd wrongly suspected, and then, eyes cast downward, to the cabin at large. Matteo, who had been watching from the galley, felt an enormous sense of relief. In the weeks prior, he'd witnessed Charlotte's behavior erode passenger trust. Now, the unsuspecting passenger she had repeatedly humiliated was none other than a Congresswoman poised to revise the very regulations that shaped their workplace. Harriet's patient resilience and final, measured confrontation had delivered the karmic lesson Charlotte sorely needed. As the flight neared Washington, D.C., the remaining turbulence was not from the weather, but from the wave of realization coursing through Charlotte. She retreated to the galley, struggling to keep tears at bay. Harriet, noting her retreat, felt a mixture of satisfaction and empathy. Perhaps Charlotte had personal troubles fueling her negativity. Harriet believed in rehabilitation and second chances. Nevertheless, consequences were necessary to highlight the seriousness of her actions. Charlotte's entire demeanor shifted. She began moving down the aisle, asking politely if anyone needed additional water or snacks. Where before her tone was brusque, now it was contrite. Passengers, while surprised, accepted her olive branch, though some remained wary. Harriet kept her expression neutral, resolute in ensuring that this transformation wasn't just a fleeting moment of fear, but a genuine sign of remorse. Behind Harriet's seat, quiet discussions abounded. Gerald whispered to a neighboring passenger, "She's the Congresswoman who's been championing better healthcare coverage." I read about her fight in the Washington Post. Others chimed in, recalling Harriet's presence on TV interviews and the powerful speeches she'd given on the House floor. The crowd marveled that Harriet had endured Charlotte's repeated jabs with patience, saving her reveal for the decisive moment that left no doubt about the flight attendant's wrongdoing. Touchdown at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport felt like a triumphant moment for Harriet. She gazed out at the city's skyline, familiar, imposing, the place where she carried out her sworn duty to represent her constituents. Though the flight had tested her patience and overshadowed her personal insecurities, Harriet emerged stronger, determined to channel this unpleasant experience into positive change. The pilot welcomed everyone to D.C., and Harriet noted with approval that Captain Myers offered a sincere apology over the intercom for any unfortunate experiences or remarks that may have occurred on board. As the plane taxied to the gate, Harriet collected her laptop bag and stood in the aisle. A hush hung in the air as passengers anticipated a final showdown. Charlotte approached. No trace of her former arrogance left. She extended her hand tentatively. "Congresswoman Lockwood, I'm sorry," she repeated, voice trembling. "I was out of line. It's been a stressful time, but it doesn't justify my behavior." Harriet studied her for a moment. "I appreciate the apology," she said quietly. "Let this be a wake-up call. No one deserves to be treated the way you treated me. I don't want to see you lose your job, Charlotte. But I will be reporting this incident to your supervisors and to the committees that oversee airline consumer experiences. We need better training, better systems in place, so people aren't shamed for their appearance or singled out unfairly." Charlotte nodded, understanding the seriousness of the matter. Then Harriet turned, shoulders set, and disembarked the plane. She had a committee meeting in the morning where, ironically, airline consumer rights were on the agenda. She would make sure her fellow representatives knew precisely how urgent the issue truly was. As Harriet reached the terminal, she glanced behind to see Charlotte being taken aside by two Delta Airlines supervisors who had been summoned after receiving complaints from passengers. Harriet didn't linger to hear their discussion. She had her own responsibilities to attend to. Yet word soon spread that Charlotte faced an immediate suspension pending an internal investigation. Some might view it as harsh punishment, but Harriet believed in accountability. People who worked in service industries should understand the gravity of insulting and belittling those they're meant to serve. The passengers from that fateful flight passed around Harriet's name like a secret. Social media lit up with posts praising the unidentified overweight passenger who turned out to be a Congresswoman unafraid to take action. Harriet carried her luggage through the terminal with renewed vigor, greeting an aide who was breathless with relief to see her safe and sound. She smiled gently, letting the events of the day sink in. The flight had not only reaffirmed her commitment to fight for consumer rights and fair treatment, but it also reminded her of the power of compassion. Harriet resolved to push for training programs within airline companies that emphasized empathy over judgment, accountability over prejudice. Back in her office that evening, Harriet penned her official report to the airline and the relevant House committee. She recounted the flight's events in precise detail, omitting none of the humiliating moments or the flight attendant's shift in behavior once Harriet's identity became known. She advocated for clear guidelines on respecting passengers' dignity, new protocols for addressing in-flight emergencies, and mandatory sensitivity training. As she finished typing, Harriet's phone vibrated. A message from Mateo read, "Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm sorry you had to endure all that. Just know that this means a lot for so many of us." Harriet smiled, recalling his empathy, Gerald's understanding, and the nurse's willingness to help the stricken passenger. Amid darkness, they had been lights of compassion, showing that not everyone in the cabin was driven by prejudice or cynicism. It was well after midnight when Harriet finally set her phone aside. She leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the day's improbable events. From the moment Charlotte first greeted her with disdain, Harriet could never have predicted the turbulent arc of the flight. Yet now, Harriet believed that sometimes such confrontations had to happen, that real change required uncomfortable truths to surface. And she felt certain that Charlotte had learned an unforgettable lesson, one that would echo across the airline community and beyond. The next morning, Harriet walked purposefully into the committee hearing room on Capitol Hill. Clutching the laptop that had nearly been wrecked mid-flight, she felt the presence of the supportive passengers she'd met. She thought of the ailing man, the frightened older woman, the wrongly accused musician, all impacted by Charlotte's misguided anger. Soon, Harriet addressed the room filled with fellow representatives, airline officials, and consumer advocates. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've convened to discuss the critical importance of treating passengers with respect and dignity," she began. "I'm here to share my personal encounter with a flight attendant whose insensitivity underscores the need for thorough reforms." She delved into the specific ways legislation could be enhanced, strengthening passengers' rights to safe and respectful treatment, requiring comprehensive training for flight attendants to handle diverse passenger needs, and advocating for accountability measures that encouraged compassion over condemnation. As Harriet spoke, her words carried the force of lived experience. By the end of her testimony, the room was abuzz. Reporters cornered Harriet in the corridor, hungry for details. She offered no personal vendettas or sensational soundbites, just a balanced call for reforms aimed at ensuring every traveler, regardless of size or background, was treated justly. That day became a watershed moment in Harriet's career. While the flight attendant named Charlotte faced disciplinary action, Harriet had sparked a national conversation about empathy in the skies. And that, she believed, was the truest form of karmic retribution, turning one person's cruelty into a catalyst for widespread positive change. Thank you, dear viewers, for joining us on this remarkable journey of secrets revealed, prejudices exposed, and destinies intertwined at 35,000 feet. With a single flight, countless lives were forever changed, and an influential Congresswoman found new resolve to champion the dignity of every traveler. If this story inspired you to stand up against injustice or reminded you of the power of compassion, let us know in the comments below. Your engagement helps us share more riveting narratives with the world. So please remember to give this video a thumbs up, share it with friends who need a dose of hope, and subscribe to